back to everybody for what we know will be another exciting evening. Many people recall that last week, Professor Harry Greenhouse explored with us the benefits that higher education might yield for the general public. But he maintained those benefits do not occur magically or without effort, and rather the deals to the populace can depend very much on the effectiveness of learning and teaching. Now, his discussion turned attention to conditions that potentially can reduce that effectiveness, or in contrast, can enhance the effectiveness of the matters that the public benefits from. Tonight's lecture continues the interest in higher education and public well-being, with a focus especially on the links between education and democracy. Dinah Hess, the Dean of the School of Education, is well known for her emphasis on the democratic goals of education. Her work indicates that for democracy to work, education must do such things as promote tolerance, opportunity, mutual respect. In a number of ways, that emphasis harkens back to themes from the first lecture, the lecture about the progressive era that Professor Hobler did for us. Professor Hobler, you will recall, I don't just tell you things you already know, of course. Professor Hobler pointed out the gross inequities that prevailed in the late 19th century. He pointed to the fact that in Wisconsin, a cadre emerged that envisioned its public higher education institution, University of Wisconsin, that envisioned this institution as a force for change. So it was amidst this kind of period of the kind of gross inequities in power and other resources. But over the years, the idea of education as critical for democracy received less and less attention, especially from the scholarly community. It did not disappear for people such as Dean Hess, and she stands out among those who have reclaimed the topic and brought back attention to the scholarly work that's possible, that's needed if we're going to understand links between education and democracy. But hers is not a return to the past. Instead, she talks about contemporary developments that call for scholarship on education and democracy. So it's not identical to what Bascom would have focused on, but it has the same concern about what are those conditions that make it essential for us to think about education and democracy. She suggests, for example, that the current scholarship must take into account seismic civic and political divisions that prevail in our own time. She's won awards for her research to improve education policy and practice. And tonight, we are privileged to hear her reflections on advancing democracy and social integration in the face of heightened polarization. Dean Hess.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Merritt, for the lovely introduction. I am so honored to participate in this remarkable course. Unlike many of you, I am not an alum of the university, but even before I came here, first as a professor in 1999, the university has had a very important influence on my life. My grandfather, Gunther Myland, graduated from this university after serving in World War I. He studied English literature and education, and I have his transcript, and I also have the first letter he wrote applying for a teaching job at Wauwatosa High School. And in that letter, he talked about how much he had learned while he was here as a student, but he also said he was very tall. And as a consequence, he believed he would not have any discipline problems. That was not a very persuasive letter. He was not hired there. And eventually, he ended up being a professor at Northern Michigan University. I grew up hearing about the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and there's no doubt that his discussions about what he had learned here influenced his only child, my mother, who in turn influenced me and my siblings. Now, fast forward more than 60 years, when his child, my mother, was dying of cancer. I remember driving her from DeKalb, Illinois, where we lived, to the remarkable hospital here for an experimental treatment, it actually was experiential as well, that made her last few months much less painful than they would have been otherwise. Now, at the time, I was a brand new teacher, high school teacher, at Downers Grove South High School in Illinois. Now, very embarrassingly, I need to admit to the students here that my high school record didn't begin to qualify me for admission to this great university. But I was, nonetheless, fortunate to land a teaching position in a high school with a terrific social studies department. It was led by people who did attend this university, and they were taught by professors who at the time were, and are still today in retrospect, among the great minds and great researchers in social studies education. In particular, Professor Fred Newman was one of their major professors. He believed that teaching young people how to talk about political issues would help them develop into more engaged citizens than they would be otherwise. He had done groundbreaking work at Harvard. When he came here to Wisconsin, not only did he continue his research, but he also was a terrific teacher, and he taught a whole generation of people who went on to become terrific teachers. And I just lucked out to land in a high school full of teachers in this department who had been taught by Fred Newman. Now, fast forward another couple of decades, I eventually found my way into a PhD program at the other UW in Seattle. And just as I was finishing my degree in education and in law, and I was researching what young people learned from, guess what, discussing political issues, my advisor called me with great excitement, and he said, "You're not going to believe this. There's an opening at the University of Wisconsin-Madison." And I said, "Wow, that's great. Why is there an opening?" Fred Newman was retiring. So I applied for the job, was just thrilled when I got it. I continue to be very close with Fred Newman. We have lunch regularly. And it is clear to me that what I learned from the people who taught me at the high school, because they had been taught here by Fred Newman, influenced me in many, many ways. As a matter of fact, I'm positive that I wouldn't be standing here today had my grandfather not come to UW-Madison, had my mother not had the wonderful treatment she had here, which very favorably disposed me to wanting to come here. And clearly, if I had not been taught by people who had been taught by Fred Newman. So ever since I got here in 1999, I've been thinking first in the micro about what should I do? What should I do in my classroom, both undergraduate and graduate classes? What should my research agenda be? What kind of work should I do in the schools and in the broader community? What kind of responsibility do I have to this state and to states and nations outside of the United States? More broadly, I've been thinking about the purposes of higher education and how we can make sure that what we are doing really matters, and more importantly, that what we say matters is something that we can deliver on. So the Wisconsin idea, the very essence of this course, has always had a profound effect on me, in part because when I first came here, I heard it as a slogan. So I went through 2 days of interviews with these wonderful people in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and they kept talking to me about this thing called the Wisconsin idea, and it sounded great, and I'd actually read something about it, but I didn't realize until I got here that people really believed in it and that it really informed their daily work. And as a consequence, it really has informed my daily work. One of the things it's caused me to think about, and what I'm going to talk about tonight, is what's the relationship between what we do on this campus and what's done in higher ed more broadly, and preparing young people for participation in civic and political life. And today I'm going to argue this, that even though it's clear that higher education has many purposes, the one that I think is most important, the one that is most central, is the relationship between what we can do here as a university and how we can help young people become more civically and politically engaged. So let me start with a couple of definitions. There's a huge debate about what civic engagement means, what political engagement means. That debate is heating up now because of the role of social media, which has so profoundly influenced how people engage. But I'm going to give you tonight a very simple definition just to think about as I go through my talk. Civic engagement means things that people engage in by themselves or with others to promote the public good through working with non-governmental organizations and informal community work. So volunteering at a homeless shelter, for example, would be civic engagement. Political engagement, the way I talk about it, in contrast, generally refers to what people do individually or as a group to influence the state, either through protests, through political meetings, and also, of course, through voting. So tonight I'm going to focus on three questions. First, why is preparation for civic and political engagement a core function of higher education, specifically here at UW-Madison? And here I'm going to focus on what makes this campus such fertile ground for helping our students become more politically and civically engaged. The second question is, what are the barriers that we have to accomplishing this mission? Here I'll focus on what I call the political education paradox, which is, on the one hand, we need to prepare students to participate in what is clearly a highly partisan and very polarized political climate. On the other hand, we're expected as a public institution to do that in a way that's nonpartisan. The third thing I'll talk about is what we're currently doing on this campus, just two very concrete examples that I think show that this goal of delivering on preparing people for civic education or for civic and political participation is something that actually can be executed in practice, and that we've got some new information, quite literally, that was just announced today that I'm going to share with you at the end of my talk, that I'm hoping is going to send you out here with a smile in the way I smiled when it came across my email. So let's talk first about the why question. In other words, why is it essential for higher education to focus on civic and political outcomes? Let me just begin by saying I don't think it's very controversial. I'm not afraid to be controversial, but I don't think it's very controversial to say that our democracy is in deep trouble. And that if we're interested, as we should be as a public institution, in strengthening our democracy, it's really going to be important to have all hands on deck and to use every available tool and every available venue. I want to make a distinction between ways to recruit or motivate people on this campus into political and civic engagement and ways to teach people how to do so. I want to argue that we need to do both of those things on this campus. Now, many students come to this campus already well prepared to participate civically and politically. Some of them come from schools where they've had really first-rate civic education. Some of them come from families that are very politically engaged. Some of them have had experiences in organizations as younger people that got them interested and motivated them and helped them build the skills. But quite frankly, we know from research that many students do not come to campus with the skills they need, with the dispositions they need to really activate themselves civically and politically. So those of you who are in the class had an opportunity to read a white paper that I co-authored with Paula McAvoy and David Campbell for the Mellon Foundation. The paper is entitled The Relationship Between a Liberal Arts Education and Democratic Outcomes. And we begin the story, or the paper, with a story that I would like to share with you. So in May of 2017, Nigel Hayes, who, as you may recall, was one of the stars of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's basketball team, published an unofficial commencement speech in an online journal for sports fans. The title of the piece is "Don't Just Shut Up and Play." And in it, Hayes reflects on his 4 years as a Badger. He argues that college athletes should speak up about social issues and not shut up and play, as fans had often suggested to him when he added his voice to those who opposed the racist incidents that were happening on this campus and across the United States. In the piece, Hayes reflects on how his education here transformed him from somebody who saw college as a means to an end, more basketball, into somebody who is more civically and politically engaged. Hayes explains that before college, he never had any interest in politics. He was never really heavy, he said, into politics, and he had decided to major in finance. Then in his second year, he started to discover in liberal arts classes books that sparked his interest in politics and history, especially books about African history, civil rights, and the African American experience. This, in addition to the headlines about police shootings of African American men, made him more interested in following the news. Next, he explains, I started to realize that I needed to develop my own beliefs and then be able to defend them with facts. One of the best things about Wisconsin is that you've got thousands of students from differing backgrounds, and they all want to debate ideas. I remember more than a few times when I found myself walking behind groups of students walking around campus just to listen in on their political conversations. Now, as a result of the interplay between his coursework, what he was learning from other students, and events outside of campus, Hayes had become politically vocal. To his critics who told him to shut up and play, he responded that he had done exactly what was expected of him in college. He learned how to think critically about his role in society. So what can we tease out from his story? The first time I read it, I thought of a couple things. One is that it illustrates how a diverse student body can be such a powerful democratic asset. That one of the best things about higher education, especially on a campus like this, is that if things go the way they should, you encounter regularly people who are quite different from you. They may have grown up in a different kind of community than you grew up. They may have grown up in a different country than the one you grew up with. They may be a different race, a different ethnicity, a different religion, a different socioeconomic class. There are all sorts of ways in which this difference comes together. And one of the things that I think is most important for us to focus on now on this campus is how to broaden access, how to make sure that we open up the university even more than we have, so we make sure that we have lots of different kinds of people here, because that is the way people will learn about the things that Harry talked about last week. How do we deal with difference in a meaningful way that doesn't demonize it on the one hand and doesn't withdraw from it on the other? And I think what Nigel Hayes was telling us in his story is that he found this campus a place where he encountered that difference. I did some research a number of years ago with Paula McAvoy in about 20 high schools in 3 states, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. I'd like to say that we chose those states because they were so dramatically different from one another, and in fact they are. But we really chose them because we could drive to the schools that we were doing observations in. And one of the things that we were focused on is, what difference does it make if students are in a class with students who are quite different than they are politically? especially if in that class the teacher is actively trying to get them to talk with one another. And in a nutshell, here's what we learned. Is that some classes are much more homogeneous than others. It's never the case that all people agree about all issues. But high schools tend to look like they're communities. Communities are more or less politically heterogeneous. So in these homogeneous classrooms, it was really hard for teachers to get students to thoughtfully consider multiple and competing views unless they had some way to insert them or some way to really protect the minority students in the class, minority ideologically I'm speaking of here, in order to make sure that their voices were raised. It wasn't impossible. We saw lots of teachers who were able to do it well, but it was really hard. In the politically heterogeneous classes, it was easier on the one hand. It had more potential for conflict, which was harder. But one of the things that we noticed is in the classes that were politically heterogeneous, if the teacher talked all the time, which unfortunately was the case in some of these classes, the students had no idea that they were surrounded by people who had different views than they had, that they really believed that everybody in the class must share their same views because why not? They had no evidence to the counter. On the other hand, in the classrooms where teachers were focused quite intensively on teaching these young people how to talk about these highly controversial political issues, that students became much more aware of the political diversity that was in their midst. And it led to this key finding, that if we want to take advantage of a diverse student body, and almost all student bodies are diverse in some ways, then we have to make sure that students are actually talking with one another about really important things. Because if we don't, we are literally throwing away difference as a deliberative or democratic asset. So we often think about, well, how do you manage difference and how do you manage disagreement? In the conception that I'm talking about here, you welcome it. You say that difference is an asset and it's one to be plumbed, because we want people on the one hand to learn how to talk with people who are different than they are and who have different political views, and on the other hand to do it in a way where they still feel the bonds of what Danielle Allen calls political friendship. Political friendship doesn't mean that we're best friends. It doesn't mean that we're doing something after class. What political friendship means is the inherent respect that you have for somebody else, regardless of what their views are. And that is extremely difficult, especially in our contemporary democracy. One of the things that we've seen on this campus and some others is that certain kinds of courses are really good at teaching this. So on this campus, as many of you know, freshmen can volunteer into courses that are called FIGs, freshman interest groups. How many of you have been in a FIG? So lots, that's great. So FIGs are small classes. It's a class usually of about 20. And attached to it are two other classes. Those are often larger, but that group of 20 is in these three classes together. And the professors that teach the central class, the small class of 20, have almost always designed some really interesting class, something that they really, really themselves care about. And they've designed it and they teach it in a way where students are really doing a lot of work together and a lot of talking together. Now, there's been a lot of data collected on these FIGs. And one of the things that we find about the FIGs is that the FIGs are more diverse than the classes that other freshmen are taking that are not FIGs. That the FIGs, by definition, are drawing in a more diverse student population. And that many of the freshmen who come to this campus come from places that are really quite homogeneous. And so when they get to campus, they experience this campus as a place that is probably the most diverse place they've ever encountered. Now, that's not the case for some other students. Some other students have come from places that are markedly more diverse, and they see this campus as a place that's different than where they had last been. I'll give you an example of this. About 18 years ago, one of my first graduate students came here from Stanford. He grew up in India, immigrated when he was 8 years old, went to a high school in New York City, and then had gone to relatively elite but fairly diverse universities. The first day he was here, he said to me, "Diana, this place looks like Norway 20 years ago." To him, it just seemed monolithically white. Now, he was teaching, as a teaching assistant, a group of students who were learning how to be high school social studies teachers. And many of these students had come from relatively small communities in Wisconsin. And to these students, they experienced not only this campus, but the Madison schools as much more diverse places than what they had been used to. So imagine what it's like in these small FIGs. Your first semester, typically, on this campus, where you are encountering people who really are in many ways quite different from you, and you are quite different from them. What we know is that teachers who do a good job teaching these FIGs see that difference as a deliberative asset. And what they're trying to do is to structure a course in a way that those students really get to know one another, but they also get to know one another's ideas, and most importantly, they get to know that they have ideas that are different from one another. We also have community-based learning classes, and I see in the room Lisa Chambers, who's the staff director of the Morgridge Center for Public Service, which is a remarkable center we have on this campus that helps faculty create courses that combine work on this campus with work in the community, which is why they're called community-based learning. So here's an example. One of the classes in the School of Education that was taught a couple of years ago by a wonderful professor, Travis Wright, who does research on how young people who are homeless fare in schools and what schools can do to help young people. So he was teaching about this in the class on campus, and then the students were volunteering in the schools as part of the course, trying to do what his both theory and empirical work had suggested needed to be done to make sure that students who were homeless were getting a better shot in school than they would have otherwise. Now, there's all sorts of community-based learning classes like these, and the thing that's interesting about those classes is that by definition, they get students from this campus off this campus. And one of the things that we know often happens when students go to a university is they get into a bubble on the university campus, and even if that campus is diverse, they're still not really becoming part of or contributing to or really learning from the community. So these community-based learning classes, I think, are something that really we know from a lot of research make quite a difference. Let me just talk about one other thing before I turn to my next major point. That having opportunities to work together in student orgs or opportunities to volunteer in the community really makes a difference. That one of the things that we hear from students is, I never knew that this was so fulfilling or interesting until I did it. And we also hear from them down the line after they've graduated that because they got the support they needed to do that kind of work here, they were much more likely to build that into their daily routine once they were no longer on this campus. So in a nutshell, my argument is that one reason why we on this campus should care about preparing young people for civic and political participation is because this is a really good site to do it. We've got lots of students. They're different from one another. We've got all sorts of courses that can be constructed in such a way to do what Harry was talking about last week, to get people to meaningfully engage. So to have all these assets and not use them toward that goal would be really a problem, because in a large way, this is the major asset for students at that age. It's much harder to do this for students who are not on campuses. One of the reasons why there is such a strong relationship between participation in higher ed And political participation specifically is because people have so many opportunities on college campuses that students who are not in higher education don't have. So now let's turn to the barriers. So I want to begin by talking just briefly about political polarization. One of my favorite books is this book called The Big Sort. It's a little dated now empirically, but the central theme of what was identified in this book continues. And in a nutshell, what Bill Bishop argues in The Big Sort is that for about 20 years now, people in the United States have been more likely to move to live next to people who are like them than they were in the past. And so we are sorting ideologically into red cities, into not actually very many red cities, but some red cities, into blue cities. We've got red states, we've got blue states. We've got some communities that are ideologically heterogeneous, but many, many fewer than we used to have. And I want to give you some evidence of this. So what I'm going to show you in just a minute is a map of the United States in 1992. And when you see the map, you'll notice that there are little parts of it that are red. And those are counties that in 1992, a huge majority of people voted for the Republican presidential candidate. Some of the areas are blue. Those are counties that are the reverse. A huge percentage of people voted for the Democratic candidate. And you'll see that a lot of the counties are neither red nor blue, which means that they were politically pretty heterogeneous. So this is what it looked like. Now, I'm just curious, and when you do this, I'm going to ask everyone to kind of turn around and look. How many of you were born before 1992? Raise your hand. Okay, so more than half of you were born before 1992, although some of you might have been 2 years old in 1992, so you probably weren't paying attention to ideological diversity in counties in the United States. But what's interesting to me as I think back to 1992 is that I really wasn't aware of the fact that so many people were living in parts of the country where they were going to be naturally encountering people who were quite different than they were politically. Now let's go 4 years into the future. And you can see more red, more blue. Now get ready. Look at this. Huge change. And here is 2016. Now let's put it another way. If you look at this map, this is kind of the same thing. It shows landslides by county. And the first time I looked at this map, I thought, wait a minute, this cannot be empirically accurate. Because it can't be the case that we are almost a 50-50 split country with this kind of map. But of course, geographers can explain this, because what I'm going to show you now is this same map correcting for population. And this is what it looked like. So one of the effects of this is that we know that people who are strong partisans are more attracted to living close to people who are also strong partisans with the same view. And people who live close to people who have the same views become more alike. So they become more partisan. And one of the things that we're seeing that has changed quite dramatically is that it used to be the case that if you were kind of a centrist politically, you were pretty likely to participate politically. But as you can see here over time, look at the difference between 1952 on the far left and 2004 on the far right. What started to happen was a really strong connection between very strong partisans and very, very frequent political participation. So the case now, and this is going to be important when we come back to it in just a few minutes, is that if you have very pronounced and very lined up political views, you are much more likely to participate politically. Here's another way to look at this. So what this illustrates is that the middle is shrinking, right? And it also shows that views are becoming more pronounced, more partisan over time. And one of the effects of that is it creates what political scientists and sociologists are calling affective polarization, which means, in a nutshell, you don't like people who are different from you politically. So let's look at this. So what we see here is in 1994, not that long ago, not very many people had unfavorable attitudes about people who were in a different political party than the one that they either felt that they were aligned to or were at least closer to. It just wasn't that pronounced. But look at how pronounced it is in 2016. And this, I think, is in some ways the most shocking and to me personally very scary. So this was a question about, are people who are in different political parties than you a threat to the nation's well-being? And as you can see here, huge numbers of people believe not just that, well, you're different, you've got different ideas about how the country should operate, but because you have different ideas, A, I don't like you, and B, I think you are a threat. So that is what causes me to worry about this thing I call the political education paradox. So on the one hand, we need to teach students how to participate politically in a highly partisan environment. This is the world people are going out into, and this is the world that they're in here. So when students civically and politically participate here, it is this climate that they are participating in. And so if we look at data about who participates, you could imagine saying, well, what we want to do is create partisans. Because if we want our students to participate, and we know that the more partisan you are, the more likely you are to participate, let's just get them here and turn them into partisans. Not necessarily one political party or another, but just let's make sure that they develop a partisan identity. Because people who answer the question, what do you think about an important issue, with either I don't know or I don't care, guess what? Those people don't participate politically. So getting people to say what their views are and why itself is something that triggers political participation. But that's a problem, because we don't like to think of ourselves in higher education as engines to perpetuate the very wrongs that we know are troubling our system. The fact that we've got this incredible political polarization, I would argue, is really problematic. It has some actual salutary effects as well. It causes more participation. But the kind of participation and the kind of political climate that it's creating is not one that strikes me as particularly healthy. So we don't want to recreate that. We don't want to perpetuate it. We don't want to cement it. On the other hand, that is the reality. And we also expect universities to be nonpartisan places. Now, I don't mean that people on this campus aren't partisan. Of course they are. But I think it would be troubling if we said, well, the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a Republican university, or the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a Democratic university. That sounds really problematic to me. So we need to be a nonpartisan space. Our job can't be that we're trying to create people in a particular political image. So we have to operate in a way that is nonpartisan, not just theoretically, but actually, where students can come in regardless of their political views and believe that they're getting a fair shake, that their views are being included, that their views are being heard. It's hard to do that in this climate. And I can tell you that professors really struggle with it. They struggle with, on the one hand, wanting students to talk and talk a lot about political issues, because we know political talk is political education. On the other hand, they want to do it in ways where people actually feel like they're being included. It's not impossible to do. In the study that I talked about in high schools that was in this book called The Political Classroom, we have all sorts of case studies of how people do this with 17 and 18-year-olds. And on this campus, I think we've got all sorts of models for how people do this. But it's a barrier nonetheless, because it causes people to be worried about the allegation that they're not engaging in fair play. It also causes them to be really troubled ethically about how to make decisions about core issues like, should I share my own views or should I withhold my views? If I share my views, can I do that in a way that doesn't shut down conversation? And if I withhold my views, am I taking away from students a political role model that may be helpful? Not because they're going to want to follow my views. We actually know empirically that even though people think that a professor says something and students believe it, the students in the room know this empirically. That's actually not true. There's all sorts of things that people can say about what their views are that are not automatically adopted by their students. However, to have the kinds of discussions where people feel like they're being treated fairly, that are intellectually rigorous, we know that people really need to know how to teach well and in a particular way. So we started a couple years ago this project on campus called the Discussion Project. And let me end with this. There's kind of two bits of things that I'm pretty optimistic about. The Discussion Project is designed to teach professors and lecturers and teaching assistants how to create high-quality discussions in their classes. Not necessarily discussions of political or social issues. It could be discussions of something in a chemistry class. But the idea is that we know students learn and learn a lot from discussion. We know that participating in discussion has good political outcomes. It helps people see one another in a different way. And so we decided to embark, quite frankly, on an experiment to see, could we design a way to teach people how to do this? So for about 2 years, we've been doing that. We've had a couple of hundred people, including some people in this room, who participated in the discussion project. And what we're learning from the people who participated is really interesting. One thing we're learning is that they are learning so much from their students' views. So like Harry said last week, one of the nice things about teaching with discussion is that as the teacher, you can listen to what students are saying, and you will not only learn so much from them and so much about them that you won't learn when you're the one doing all the talking, but you also can get a sense of whether or not the kind of interactions that you're trying to promote are actually happening. So we think that we're kind of on to something with the discussion project. Next year, we're going to take it to an HBCU, we hope Morgan State, and a Hispanic serving institution, we hope UC Riverside. We'll continue to have it here and actually ramp it up here, because now we're actually doing empirical research on it. We're trying to figure out if people can be taught how to be better discussion teachers, and when they are, do the students in their classes learn things in a different way than they would with professors who hadn't been taught that. So stay tuned. More to come empirically about the discussion project. Let me turn finally to this thing that was just released nationally last Thursday and was just released on our campus today. So there's a national study of learning, voting, and engagement that's done by a remarkable group of researchers at Tufts University. It's been going on since 2012, and there are over 1,000 universities across the United States, including this one, that participate in the research. And here's how the research works in a nutshell. We know that whether or not somebody voted, and by what means they voted, whether they voted absentee, whether they voted on election day, that's public record. Student records, on the other hand, are not public record. So for universities participating in this study, they agreed to merge student records and voting records to get a sense of whether their students are voting or not, in what ways are they voting, how that is changing, if it is changing, and what difference does it make, for example, if you're an engineering student compared to if you're a student in library sciences. So I've been intrigued by this research for years. I know the researchers really well. I talked to them last Friday about what they had learned from their most recent release. And what they released last week was a comparison of participation by students, undergrads and graduate students, in 2018, the midterm elections we just went through, compared to the last federal midterm elections in 2014. So in a nutshell, here's what they found, which is remarkable. So those of you who are kind of political wonks and pay attention to things like are people voting, you probably remember that the big story the day after Election Day in the fall of 2018 was, wow, was turnout ever up? It was turnout ever up. It was up kind of across all ages, and especially among young people. But it was up more dramatically among young people who are in higher ed than among young people who weren't in higher ed. And specifically, it was up, almost 20%. So then when we got our data, we were really, really interested. And one reason we were interested is, you may remember if you were on this campus last fall, there was a big emphasis on getting students, faculty, and staff registered and in getting people to turn out to vote. So there was the Big Ten voting challenge. You might remember that. We still don't know the results of that. We should in a couple of weeks, because it was waiting on these data. And there was just a whole lot of activity going on. So people on campus were really interested in, well, did it make any difference? And here's one of the things that we found, is that the increase that we saw with our students, while not as dramatic as what happened nationally, was unusually dramatic, because if you look at 12, 14, 16, and 18, what you can see is that the increase in the midterm election in 18 actually surpassed the last general election. Now, we know generally that people don't vote a lot in midterm elections, right? Now, they do in places where you've got real races, and think back, we had real races. But it's really remarkable. When I talked to the researchers, they said you were one of the few campuses in the country where this happened, where the increase was so dramatic that it actually exceeded what had been the voting rate in 16. One thing that happened is the number of students who were registered increased dramatically. Compared to the national average, see that dotted line? So that's where everyone else was, and this is where we were, so it was pretty high. And then our overall rate was high. So again, see that dotted line? That's everyone else together. And as you can see, we are pretty high. Now what's interesting is that in 16, our voter participation rate had actually gone down from 2012, which was very, very worrisome. In 2018, it rebounded quite dramatically. So let's turn to the question now of what difference does it make what you major in? First thing is, it makes a huge difference what you major in. Look at this. So across the country and also on this campus, you're more likely to vote if you're in one of three majors. Library science. People who are studying to be librarians, any librarians in the room? Like, they are the best voters imaginable. They just vote like crazy on almost every campus. People who are studying public policy, it makes sense that they would turn out, right? People who are studying history also tend to vote. Education students have really high rates of participation across the university generally and on this campus specifically. The thing that has worried political scientists, and I will end with this kind of call to action, is that nationally and on this campus, there's a huge voting achievement gap between STEM and non-STEM students. That STEM students who in the past, 20 years ago, we don't think voted at very different rates than non-STEM students, now are less likely to participate. Now, this is not monolithic. There's an engineering school in the United States where 83% of the students voted. But for the most part, the trend is that the more STEM, the less likely you are to participate. Now, I think the biggest question is, why in the world would that be?
Are we more skeptical?
Could be. Why else?
Less civically engaged, more intense about their work and studies.
Okay, this is what I've heard from some engineering deans. They're like, well, our students don't have time to do anything but study engineering. Go ahead.
I think a lot of the STEM students are non-citizens, possibly in a higher percentage, and I don't think this data is corrected for that.
It isn't corrected for it, but they have averaged a correction for it. And they believe that at best it would make a 4% difference. But that's, I think, a really important point. One of the things they're trying to do is to get the data reported out for the next election where they can really make sure they have those numbers right.
Is it because of larger lectures and then more technically focused discussions?
Could be. Could be less opportunity to participate in the kinds of classes that we know spark political participation.
People who are in the humanities are taught to make connections. And I think if you make connections to things, you're more apt to be engaged in a larger society.
Could be. So let's just stop with these two comments, the first one and the last one. The first one is like, well, you're less likely to vote because you're more skeptical. So in other words, you might have good reasons not to participate, like you're trained to be a skeptic. And the final reason is, well, if you have more humanities classes, you're probably more likely to build some things that are going to cause you to politically engage. I'm not going to tell you I have an answer to this, but I'm really fascinated by it. And I'm worried about it. Because here's what I worry about. That I actually am totally uninterested in my university role in who people vote for. I'm extremely interested in that they vote, not because that's the be-all and end-all, because I think there's all sorts of other forms of political and civic participation that are equally as, and in some cases could be even more important, more significant. But whether or not you vote is a proxy for all sorts of other things that predict other kinds of participation. So when we're looking for a rough proxy about how much are people paying attention to and how much do people care about what's happening politically and civically in the society that they live in, whether or not they vote is something that's worth paying some attention to. And the fact that we've got some groups of students who are much less likely to do that than others tells me that we need to do something differently than what we're currently doing. Let's end real quickly with what do you think accounted for the fact that we had this huge increase on this campus? And I want to suggest a couple things to you. One is we were part of a national trend, right? But still, the difference between our voter participation rate and the average was quite significant. And the fact that we went up over the last general election is even more significant. And I think it's because the students and the faculty and staff here were so committed last fall to getting people registered and getting people out to vote. I know that in the School of Education, we had faculty and staff who volunteered to register students to vote. We were running voter registration all over this campus. We teamed up with the League of Women Voters. We had all sorts of graduate students who were involved in this. We had our printmakers. You know, we have the #1 printmaking program in the United States. It's in the art department. And the art department, I know you're going to think this is odd, is in the School of Education. So the printmakers were printing up all these special things that they were putting out all over. And there was a local artist in town who had graduated from our art department who, with a group of people, did these crocheted things with all sorts of things on Bascom Hill about why it's good to participate. And there was just a lot of stuff up that people were seeing. I loved this sign that somebody put up in one of the 17 buildings that the School of Education is in. Democracy means you have to do something. So let me end with this. In addition to thinking about higher ed, I also think a lot about high schools and what we should be doing in high schools. And for that reason, we organize a conference every fall before a major election for teachers from all over Wisconsin. It's actually not just high schools. Like kindergarten teachers come to this, about how to teach about the elections. And when we did one last fall, we decided we were going to, as part of our swag, have t-shirts. So we designed this t-shirt. It said on the front, Teach like democracy depends on it, and on the back because it does. And with that, I will end and take any questions you have.
Well, as Dean Hess has already indicated, she's willing to take questions. It's very hard when you've been in a classroom often just to shut up. I know I should. But your last set of questions about majors just reminded me of a report that I'm reading right now that's asking the question, why are women underrepresented in certain areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? Because it shows up quite heavily in many parts of engineering, in physics, not in biology. Well, one of the reasons that's been given is that there are some disciplines that pay a lot more attention to the social issues, and that women, girls, tend to be much more attracted to the kinds of things that suggest you can make a difference to more than yourself. And so one of the recommendations out of this report has a lot to do with how do you try to make sure that there is this understanding of the link between what you can do in a discipline and those larger social concerns. So I think this whole discussion just should suggest to us a lot of things about the importance of higher education and how we seek continually to try to advance what takes place not just at an institution, but that institution in concert with its whole context. But with that, I said, she's willing to take questions, so let's see if there are questions, comments that people have. Here's one.
At the beginning of your talk, you talked about the Wisconsin idea. Towards the end, you talked about the efforts on the campus to promote voting. This and seemed to be largely successful. Has there been any attempts, and perhaps I'm sure there have been, to take some of the successes and what has been learned and take them to other UW system campuses or private schools throughout Wisconsin?
There was a lot of discussion among UW system campuses last fall about what people were doing. Some of the UW system campuses did things that were very different than what we did here. As those of you who are students know, a decision was made here not to have every student get a student ID that would make them, that could be used to vote, that instead for out-of-state students they had to get this, they could get this special ID, which was a heavy lift. And the only way around that was to design student IDs for everybody that needed to be changed every 2 years. So think about when you come as a freshman, you get an ID, you might lose it, but if you don't, you keep it for 4 years. And so that was going to be really expensive to do here, so a decision was made not to do it here. But some of the other UW system campuses did do it. So one of the things that I asked the researchers when I talked to them last Friday is, hey, did that matter? And they said they were going to look at it and let me know, and they haven't yet, so I don't know the answer to that. But there was, to respond directly, there was a lot of discussion among the campuses about what to do. I think that when we looked at the overall difference in various campuses, there was quite a range, so we're going to have to really dig into that.
Last week, Harry Brighouse made a strong plea for building discussion into classes, just as you have, saying that it's the practice that really makes a difference. And one of the questions that came up in the discussion section, what is the strongest data that actually does make a difference? Now, you've started to address that, but I'd like to hear your response to that. How do you think having that kind of a discussion, the type that you've outlined in the discussion project and talked about today, in a classroom, how do you think that best can be supported as good pedagogy?
Yeah. So discussion, if done well, builds knowledge, and knowledge builds participation. The more you understand about something, the more likely you are to participate in it. So to the extent that what we heard last week about the need to articulate your own views, often to people who might not have the same views or might be understanding them in a different way. The practice of doing that, by definition, teaches you stuff. Anybody who's a teacher knows this. When I first started teaching high school, what I knew 8th period compared to what I knew 1st period was dramatically different. You know, I kept thinking those poor students in 1st period, what they were getting was nowhere near as powerful because I was talking myself to understanding. I was talking myself into using better examples, into using better questions, etc. So I think the strongest thing is that, as we say in the discussion project, you discuss to learn, and conversely, in tandem, you need to learn how to discuss.
I think the question that had come up was, what's the evidence? Because as a researcher, and certainly as you would encourage skepticism in the absence of evidence, it's just that some of the students wanted to know, what is the evidence that discussion in fact enhances learning?
So the article that you were given, the students who were in the class, the article that we wrote for the Mellon Foundation, and if you're interested in it, if you're not in the class, it's on their website. And in that article, we really go through the studies pretty carefully. And what we say is this, that we know there's this really strong correlations that are just so strong that it causes researchers to say, well, there's got to be something here that we're not picking up something else. But we've also done a lot of experiments. So for example, the political classroom study that I did, we traced students going out after high school. We followed them, not physically, on the phone, 2 and 4 years out. And we knew exactly what had happened in their classes. We had been in their classes. We had surveyed them on everything imaginable. And we really looked at what was the relationship between these really strong classes where students were really learning how to discuss hard things in a powerful way and whether or not they participated. And there was a pretty strong relationship. And so that, I think, was seen in the field as being one of the strongest pieces of empirical evidence that we had. Now, of course, with the discussion project, right now we're not directly looking at, we're looking at effects, but we're not directly looking at the difference between what happens in classes with professors who've had this training compared to professors who haven't. But we are talking to a couple groups on campus about setting up that kind of experiment. So what we would do is to say to some teachers, go through this training and then we're going to follow you and your students and do that, and then other teachers who hadn't gone through it, follow them, and then make available to those other teachers that you could participate next semester. What we don't want to say is, well, you know, it's really terrible to be the control group, you know, eventually. And so we are in active discussion about how to do that, because it's really important in social science to not just say, well, it looks like there's a relationship.
Is it possible to get these shirts? I'd love to get them for my kids and me. We all went to this university.
Yes. You can email me. My email is easy to find online, and then I will get you in contact with the folks who have the shirts. It's really funny. We had like 200 of these shirts made that we handed out to the teachers at the conference. And teachers are incredible communicators. And so they were taking pictures of this, they were getting out on social media. All of a sudden we were being deluged by people who wanted these shirts. And even some other universities then printed up their own. And so we are continually making them. We also have new discussion project shirts that say, learn to discuss and discuss to learn, which I think, you know, anytime you have shirts, you know you're official.
Thank you. What is, in your opinion, the most favorable outcome that the teaching of civic and political engagement can have, specifically in relation to the level of polarization and a functioning democracy?
So the FIGs that I talked about before, they survey students about what they learned from the FIG classes. And a remarkable number of students participate in the surveys, and they have open-ended questions. So those of you who were in FIGs, I hope you participate in these surveys. And I was just talking to Nathan Phillips, who runs the FIG program, and he does an amazing job. And one of the things that they're noticing in what the FIG students are saying is, and this is unprompted, they're not asked, does this happen to you? They're asking what happens, and students say this. And they say, In this class, I learned how to talk to people who had different views. And I learned, more importantly, or equally as important, how to listen to people who had different views. So the students were volunteering this, and I was really impressed by that. And to me, that is the answer to your question. That I think that the demonization of difference that has become so prevalent in our society is really dangerous. I think it's dangerous in families. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of friends who now dread Thanksgiving. It's dangerous among friend groups. It's dangerous at work. It's certainly dangerous in the political community. And so anything we can do to help people understand that it's possible to have differing points of view and still be a good person. Now, it doesn't mean that all points of view should be supported, and it doesn't mean that there aren't some points of view that are just vile. But I think that there are so many times when the instinct toward generosity, toward saying, you know, I really want to hear you out. Tell me why you think that. And I have an obligation to explain to you not just what I think, but why I think it. I think the more people can learn how to do that and have it feel good to them, have it feel rewarding, I think ultimately that's the best outcome we can hope for.
Hi, I'm curious to learn more of your analysis when it comes to student athletes using their platforms. Also as a student athlete myself, but seeing someone like Nigel who gets great respect, but utilizing, I guess, education in terms of what we learn, also analyzing coming from possibly marginalized community in high school to a university such as Wisconsin, being a minority at a PWI, utilizing that environment, of course, more to within research or even expressing a lot of background information that the masses can learn from.
I think we need to do a lot more work than we have done. I'm really interested in students who come to this or other campuses who are in an underrepresented group, and how those students are experiencing what's happening not just in class, but what's happening in the dorms, what's happening all over campus. And I think what we're most interested in is making sure that we create an atmosphere where students feel included. And I think that if you, the more likely people are to feel included, the more likely they are to participate. That being said, the reason we started this article with the story about Nigel is I was really intrigued by that. The fact that he wrote this commencement address, it went viral. I mean, there are professors on this campus who have written books that they would love to have as many people read as read Nigel Hayes' commencement address. So it had an influence. So I think that there are some students that are in positions where they have powerful megaphones, and when they use them, I think it matters. Sorry.
Who are you pointing to? No, to the young woman here. Okay.
Should I hold this? Or? Okay. So I agreed with your point about polarization. What I was wondering is a lot of the more polarizing political conversations I'm witnessing in class are because more people have voices now. Women have voices, people of color, queer people have more of a voice than they used to. And a lot of times it's that people are no longer willing to kind of, like, people are fed up with hearing these opinions that are directly against their identity. So I'm wondering how you can reconcile living in a less polarized political environment with also not allowing hate speech to continue, or the speech of people who are complicit in a party which maybe is promoting that sort of speech.
So herein lies, I think, one of the hardest challenges we have, which is determining what are we going to consider legitimate speech, and what is speech where it's a different perspective. We want to hear different perspectives. It's really important, especially from groups who have historically not been allowed to participate in the political community. So how do we decide, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds. In Singapore, they actually have this concept that's called outside the boundary something. It's OBM, outside the boundary marker. So teachers will constantly talk about, well, we can't talk about that because that's an OBM. That's an outside the boundary marker. And if we talk about that, we would be inviting things into the classroom that we shouldn't invite, although Singapore has done a lot of work on getting teachers trained to how to help students talk about more controversial issues. So it's changing there somewhat. And so when I was first there, it sounded so weird to me. It's like, what's an outside the boundary marker? And one really great teacher pulled me inside and said, well, you might not have that concept label in the United States, but clearly every society has that concept, right? Every society has ways in which we say what's inbounds and what's out of bounds. And I think one of the hardest things right now about what's happening in our political climate is that there's so much debate about what should be in and what should not be in. I think there are things that people are hearing said that they're like, wait a minute, that seems like that is so outside what should be acceptable. And there are other people who are hearing those same things and saying, that reflects my views. So I think for not just campuses, I can tell you for elementary school teachers, how to make decisions about what kind of speech you want to promote and what kinds of civility you want to promote is really, really challenging. I'll give you an example of this from my own experience as a high school teacher. So I started teaching high school 40 years ago this fall, 1979. And I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hands about who was not born then. And in 1979, the question about was the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II justified was actually taught as a controversial issue. That in textbooks, even the most left-wing textbooks, that was presented as, there were pros and cons to that. Yes, it was justified. No, it wasn't. And I remember as a high school teacher being trained to teach young people how to deliberate that issue because that was seen as a matter of legitimate controversy. And after about 1983, 84, there's a lot of activity happening nationally. Reparations were being discussed in Congress. There was an official apology that the idea about Japanese internment started to change. And I remember going to one of my colleagues who was 20 years older than I was. His name was Dave Harvey, and I said to Dave, I am nervous about the way we're teaching this. I don't know why we're teaching this as a controversial issue. It seems to me that this is an issue that's changing. Now, at the time, I didn't have the word for it that I have now. I now call that tipping. When an issue tips from being a settled question to a more open question. So what Dave Harvey said is, oh, Diana, what you think is bad is progress. And I was like, what's progress about that? He said, when I started teaching, the question was the Japanese internment justified? And the right answer was yes. We didn't teach it as a controversy. So when we opened it up as a controversy, that seemed to be this huge progressive step. And now, if you analyze textbooks, or if you look at films, or in almost all cases, how people are teaching that question, it's being taught as a question for which there's a right answer, and the right answer is it wasn't justified. So in my lifetime, in 40 years, we saw this major question go from being a settled question, it's a question for which there's a right answer that we're going to teach people to build and believe, to an open question, to a settled question. So one of the things that I'm most interested in, and I'm constantly on the lookout for this, is what are the issues that are in the tip now? And how do we deal with the problem of teaching in the tip? Because at some point, somebody's going to say, wait a minute, I think that should be opened up, or I think that should be closed. This morning there was a fantastic article in Education Week about how teachers are teaching about climate change. So you know, given what happened last week, you can imagine all the activity in schools around climate change and how teachers are struggling with it. On the one hand, what the national science standards say is climate change is not a controversial issue. The question about whether or not the climate is changing and is it caused by human behavior, that's a question that virtually all scientists agree that there's a right answer to. And the right answer is it's occurring. But we know that in the United States, more than almost any other democracy, there are huge numbers of people who don't believe that. And so teachers will say, well, what do I do then? Well, the writers of the National Science Standards, and I agree with them, by the way, say, no, you've got to teach that climate change is occurring and that it's caused by human behavior. But what to do about climate change, that's where we're in the open issue area, because there's really a lively political debate and needs to be about what we should do.
Well, I know there were a couple of other questions, but the time is up. And so please join me in thanking the Hess for